It's been about 1 year since I first started using the Godot game engine, and I wanted to talk about my experience with it, some tips, and kind of thoughts about where it is now. To preface, I started making games on Scratch in 2017, and from here learned a lot about logic behind game development. Then in late 2022, I decided to pick up game development again, and started to do my research on where to start from now on. I eventually came down to two options, Unity and Godot. Since Godot had C# support when I first found out about it, I thought that when I wanted to do more serious projects, I can just use Unity instead because I'd be using C# and I would have that experience when I switch software. And a big reasoning behind me considering Unity at this point was because of console support for future game development. Godot was also a new thing for me, and it seemed like a cool new thing that was maybe more approachable. Starting with Godot, I decided to make a game to gauge my experience with it, and during this time it took me 2 weeks to make the title screen. Now, that may sound bad, but all this time I was refreshing my experience and learning all the more about Godot. After that, I started picking up the engine and more complex things faster because I started to know the workflow. The development of this project went great. The only thing is that exporting was broken for macOS and Android, and I can't say if it was for Linux, because at the time I was developing on Windows exclusively. However, it was probably because I was using C#, and I believe when 3.5 was out, the support was still experimental, so that may have caused issues. A trend that I've noticed is that people in the Godot community will almost always suggest you to use GDScript first, and while it's what I'm using for my current project, C# brings multiple advantages and disadvantages. I guess it's because as someone who is starting out, if you're not ready to experience issues, then you're not really ready for game development or even complex game development, which is what people who want to make games will experience because they saw some video on YouTube about it and thought it may be easy to pick up. Through this first project, to be honest, my coding styles were all over the place, and there were definitely a lot of unoptimized things. But that's what a first project is for, and at least I completed something. After this, I ended up starting work on my Cave Story beta fan game, which I'm currently working on right now. When I started work on this fan game, I created it on Godot 4 Beta 10. The reason that this is important is because it was Godot 4, which was going to be a huge update at the time with things like GDScript 2, much better 3D, and more. Although I wasn't using the 3D tools and such, the improvements made to areas like the inspector, syntax, and node changes, along with massive improvement to how tile maps worked, really increased my productivity within the engine. And now it keeps getting better, which I'll get into later. However, typically in the world of software, alphas, betas, and all sorts of similar work-in-progress software has been under the consensus that there is less stability. While this was true since I ran into the odd issue or two during my development with these beta versions, the stability was on point, and at some point it even fixed itself or just stopped happening, which was surprising. Of course, not all software is like this, but it just goes to show how well maintained Godot is. At some point, I had to stay behind on a specific beta because despite the fact that Godot was at a code freeze, animation-related syntax was changed, and compatibility was broken, meaning that I had to wait for Godot 4 to be fully finished for it to properly work, so I could convert old code to support the new syntax and whatnot. This isn't the fault of Godot, and it was definitely an advantageous thing to do, but this is just the way things go when you use beta software. In the future, the experience with Godot and betas may not even be this smooth, so keep that in mind. Anyways, from here, it was definitely a lot better, and I got to try more things that I didn't in the first project, such as instantiation. At the same time, even though right now there are definitely some areas that are unoptimized, I definitely learned a lot from that first project and got to improve upon it in my second project. I also did the GMTK Game Jam 2023, and that gave me the opportunity to write a nice and optimized game. However, for this game jam, I did not use Godot 4, even though web support for it was out at the time, and instead resorted to the older 3.5 version because web exports were more compatible. And even though it was a less convenient workflow than the fancier and nicer features of Godot 4. In game development, you have to pick and choose what you want. And for example, in game jams, it's pretty much essential that your game is playable from the web browser, because if it isn't, much less people will check out your game. I'd also like to mention that while Godot 4 probably would have achieved the same and perhaps even better results, as a game developer, my personal goal is to have a game that works on as many devices as possible. And right now, Godot achieves that very well. And this is important for me because even right now, operating systems like Windows 7 and 8.1 are getting deprecated in the world of game development. Because as far as I know, game engines like Unreal Engine 5 have a minimum requirement of Windows 10, which could become an issue as it gets more widely adopted. Now, the last things I want to talk about are the future going forward and some tips. Going forward, I'll be using Godot for a lot of projects. However, I would definitely like to try more low-level game development frameworks such as FNA and Monogame, which may give me what I'm looking for, like good C# and console support. However, that's one thing I wanted to talk about. A main reason discouraging the use of Godot was the fact that you couldn't port to consoles independently, but now thanks to W4 Games, this will be a reality. So now Godot is up there with all the other big game engines, I feel, and it's even getting DirectX 12 ray tracing support at some point, which as far as I understand, has not really been an easily accessible open source resource. Now for some tips. Some people say that Godot doesn't have tutorials, and while tutorials can definitely help as a starting point, just know that you can probably find whatever you're looking for somewhere else and translate it to Godot, or break it down. The amount of tutorials for something specific is not your limitation, and you are your own limit, so keep that in mind. Try to use as up-to-date a version of Godot as possible, since because of its very good design, you will often get a lot of great benefits as opposed to just solely breaking compatibility and gaining instability. There's a Discord, Reddit, and a forums website where you can ask more specific questions for whatever issue you're facing and anything like that, and it can really help a lot since experienced people can come and respond to help. If they don't, because I know from experience that sometimes your question can get lost as other people post their questions, I believe there are more specific places to ask, so just know that. I really recommend sticking to the in-editor code editor because despite the fact that it lacks some specific, important, and helpful features, editors like VS Code can break when using the Godot Tools extension, so keep that in mind. Only use an external editor if you really need it. If you're working with 3D, the native Blender support in the engine is absolutely phenomenal, and definitely can improve your workflow of whatever project you're working on greatly. And that's it. If you haven't tried Godot, then I hope that this video convinces you to give it a try now.